You will recall, since we just did it a few days ago, that there were two distinct stories about how Saul came to be king in Israel, right? One with the private anointing and the prophetic ecstasy and the war against the Ammonites, and the other story with the casting of lots and Saul hiding in the baggage and all that. And you also may have noticed in your reading for today that there are two distinct stories of how David came to be, or came to Saul's attention, at least. So in 1 Samuel 16, just after God has removed the royal dynasty from Saul because he failed to proscribe the Amalekites, God sends Samuel to the house of Jesse, the Bethlehemite. And here we get the truer of the Cinderella stories in the Bible. Samuel goes through all of Jesse's sons, right, until he gets to the youngest one, who's not even there. He's out with the flock, right? He's the only one left. And Jesse didn't even bother to call the kid in when Samuel asked where your sons are. And note Samuel's reaction when he sees Jesse's oldest son, Eliab. Samuel reacts to his physical appearance, which is evidently quite kingly, whatever that is. And God responds, physical appearance is not part of the equation here. Pay no attention to his appearance, which is, in a sense, a direct rebuttal to the selection of Saul earlier, right? When Samuel was like, this is the dude. And he was handsome and tall and kingly, and how did that work out, right? And so again, here with David, we have this private anointing ceremony, right? Only Samuel and David and Jesse's family know that this has happened. Right? David is a secret king. Now, while the Spirit of the Lord has descended on David, it has departed from Saul. And this conceptually may remind us of the book of Judges, where it seemed like only one person at a time sort of got the Spirit of the Lord upon him, or her. But Saul has not only lost the Spirit of the Lord, he has also received an evil spirit, also from God. And, as is often the case when one is bothered in such a way, he needs his tunes. And it turns out that David has some musical talents. He did, after all, write 150 psalms, did he not? He did not. That's next semester, though. Not only can he play a mean lyre, but he also, God is with him, right? As evidently people seem to sort of sense, and which we already certainly knew. And he's handsome, which we also already knew, but we were also told doesn't matter, right? So David enters Saul's service as his lyre player and is promoted to his arms bearer, which I think we are to understand as means that he's relatively close to Saul, right? He's always by his side. He's carrying his armor, especially when he goes into battle. And he's there, but he's, present by Saul forever, in order to, play the lyre and carry his stuff. And Saul likes it and sends word to Jesse, David's father, says, I'd like to keep him with me, if that's okay, for I am pleased with him. Terrific. We're already getting the outlines of how David is going to sort of rise in the ranks and how he is known to Saul and how he enters the court. And that's all well and good until we get to the story in the next chapter, which is the story of Goliath. Look how David is introduced, even by the narrator, in the story of Goliath. David was the son of a certain Ephrathite of Bethlehem in Judah whose name was Jesse. That really looks like the first time you're meeting a character, especially when we've met him and his family before, and including Jesse. And we meet David's brothers again, seemingly for the first time, in the order of their birth. David's role in this, in the family of Jesse, as presented to us in this chapter, should look familiar, right? He does exactly what Joseph did back at the beginning of the Joseph story, right? His brothers are all off doing whatever they're doing, shepherding in the Joseph story, fighting in the David story, and David's job, like Joseph's, is to sort of run back and forth from Dad's house to sort of bring reports and food and stuff like that, right? Take these 10 cheeses, David's father says, find out how your brothers are doing and, bring me back something nice from them. Thankfully, unlike in the story of Joseph, David's brothers don't want to kill him. That would be a different tale. But David is evidently something of a pain in the butt, like Joseph was, right? Eliab's response when he shows up, right? Like, why did you come, right? What's happened to the sheep that you were supposed to be taking care of in the wilderness? You're impudent and impertinent, right? He's the littlest brother. I don't have siblings, but I've got 2 kids, and I know what this looks like. I know what the littlest one is like. Don't tell her I said so. David's response, honestly, could have been spoken by my youngest daughter. I was just asking, right? He's like a little pain in the ass kid. David, of course, goes on to defeat Goliath, as we all know, and I'm not going to get into the story too much because it's pretty well known. But what I want to point to is Saul's reaction when David comes out to fight Goliath. When Saul saw David going out to assault the Philistine, he turned to his army commander, Abner, and said, essentially, who the hell is this? Whose son is that boy? And Abner's like, find out whose son this is another way of saying, who is this, right? Find out who that is. He has no idea who David is. David is certainly not Saul's lyre player or arms bearer, right? Who you would think would have been with Saul at the battle site. So again, we have 2 stories of how David comes to Saul's attention, one with a lyre and one with a slingshot. Now, from this point forward in the story, from now until the day of Saul's death, Saul basically does little other than try to kill David in one way or another. This is first of all out of jealousy, it seems. David gets the credit for defeating the Philistines. Seems logical enough, actually. Not only credit among the troops, who now follow David dutifully, but also among the general populace, who devise a chant that elevates David over Saul. A chant which, you may have noticed, comes back more than once in the story. Saul has slain his thousands, David his tens of thousands. And Saul's reaction to this is, in a sense, quite right. To David, they've given tens of thousands. To me, they've only given thousands. All that he lacks is the kingship. Yep, that's basically right? Saul knows the story before we do, as it were. So Saul tries to kill David with his spear, but obviously he failed, otherwise our Bible would be much shorter. And Saul puts David in charge of the army in the hopes that he'll fall in battle. And he's doing all the things he can to kill him, directly, indirectly. Even marriage is as a trap set up for David. Saul says to David, right, you want to marry my daughter, Michal? Fine. Bring me back 100 Philistine foreskins. And Saul clearly thinks there's no way David can do this, or will be willing to, because gross. But of course, David does him one better and comes back with 200. And so he gets to marry into the royal family, which obviously sets him up in a much finer position, despite Saul's desires in the other direction. Saul tries to get his son and his servants to kill David, but they're having none of it, particularly Jonathan, who, of course, loves David like a quote-unquote brother. That was innuendo. Jonathan convinces Saul to bring David back. And we just, how many times in the story, as you're reading it, how many times does Saul repent of his desire to kill David? He's constantly like, I'm sorry, I know I shouldn't be doing this. And then in the very next breath, he turns around and tries to kill him again. This is indeed an evil spirit from God. Saul is presented in the text as, unstable, let's say. So just after Saul has agreed to let David back in the palace, he tries to spear him again. Saul, thankfully, not evidently so good with the spear. And then he sends men to kill David at David's home. But Michal, his wife and Saul's daughter, gets him away using, honestly, the oldest trick in the book of dressing up the bed as if he's in it. And you'll notice here that both Saul's son and Saul's daughter are complicit in David's escape from Saul, right? This is Saul being increasingly isolated, right? Again, being made in the text to look clearly like the one person who is off his rocker, and everyone else loves David. David runs away, naturally enough, runs away to Samuel, but Saul follows him. And again, we have this prophetic ecstasy that seems to come upon Saul occasionally. The Spirit of God came upon him. This is not probably the good Spirit of God, right? And he walked on speaking in ecstasy. And we again get an explanation for this saying, evidently, is Saul too among the prophets that we've seen already. But one episode of that prophetic ecstasy established Saul as king. This one essentially saves David so that he can become king. And it only gets worse. Saul eventually tries to kill his own son, Jonathan, for having sided with David. And this, evidently, is for Jonathan enough proof that Saul really probably does want to kill David. He's been holding out hope that maybe his dad was just messing around, but now he's pretty convinced. And David finally flees for good, first to a town called Nob, where he grabs some food and picks up Goliath's sword from the priest Ahimelech. Then he flees to Gath, which is a Philistine city, where he is recognized as David, that guy who, is famous for killing Philistines. And David pretends to be crazy. And then he flees to some caves, then to Moab. Finally, he flees to Judah. The man is on the run. Saul is meanwhile tracking David the whole time, and he hears from one of his servants named Doeg the Edomite that David had been to this priest Ahimelech in the town of Nob. So Saul goes and has Doeg kill Ahimelech and all of the other priests there. And he basically proscribes the town, right? He kills everybody, right? This is the harem that we saw back in Deuteronomy and in Joshua. And of course, there's an irony that Saul should be proscribing a town when Saul lost the kingship because he refused to proscribe the Amalekites. Here he is proscribing the town of Nob, one of his own cities, for having harbored David. But we should remember that whenever we have stories like this, there's always one person who escapes. In this case, Ahimelech's son Abiathar, who flees directly to David. And David, still on the run, moves to Keilah, where he saves the town from the Philistines, and Saul tracks him there again, but David escapes again, and David dwells in the wilderness of Ziph, but the Ziphites give him up to Saul, so he goes to Maon, and from there to En-Gedi, where he hides in the cave, and Saul, still chasing him, famously comes into the cave for a rest stop, where David cuts off the corner of his cloak, and this is, of course, proof that while David could have killed Saul, he didn't, right? And he has the piece of cloak to prove it. And Saul typically repents of his craziness. You get the sense there's a pattern to these stories. David now goes to the wilderness of Paran, where he encounters Nabal and Abigail. And we'll get back to that story momentarily. But again, the Ziphites give David up. They seem not to like him so much. And Saul, seemingly forgetting his earlier repentance, tries to kill David again. And this time, Saul, just not so good at the warrior thing now, falls asleep. And David sneaks up to him and swipes his jar and his spear, and we get the same message. David could have killed him, but he didn't. Right? And Saul again repents. And David finally comes to a somewhat obvious conclusion you would have thought he had reached many chapters ago. I'm going to die by this guy's hand at some point. And so he goes to Philistia, to the Philistines, right, his mortal enemies, where he lives in a town called Ziklag for a good while, pretending to the Philistines that he is raiding Judahite towns, but actually not, almost fighting alongside the Philistines as they go to battle, but not, and actually fighting against some Amalekites who seem to have snuck in and stole his stuff. And meanwhile, Saul is occupied with the battles against the Philistines. Saul, of course, at this point has no Samuel to help him. Samuel has died. God isn't talking to Saul right now. They're having a moment. So Saul raises Samuel's spirit, who basically tells him to go away. And also, while I'm telling you to go away, gives him some new information he may not have known before. God has given the kingship to David. Surprise! But this is, of course, the first time Saul knows this for sure. Remember, he suspected it way back at the beginning. All he lacks now is the kingship, Saul said. Turned out he had it all along, Samuel reveals. But Saul will never see David again. And so there's nothing he can do about this because, as Samuel reveals, tomorrow your sons and you will be with me, which is to say, dead. An obvious question that one might ask about this story, does this woman from Endor, which if it's not a planet from Star Wars, I'm mistaken. There's this woman, frequently she's called the Witch of Endor. Don't do that. It doesn't say witch, right? Like, that's like such a pejorative way of describing a woman who has, the capacity to raise the dead. Right? That's, we should stop calling her that. She's a seer. She's a sorceress. That also sounds bad, but not as bad as witch. Right? Don't use Witch of Endor. That also sounds like a C.S. Lewis book. In any case, does this woman actually raise Samuel from the dead? Does this story suggest that this kind of sorcery actually works? And the answer is yes. Of course it works. The biblical material is generally quite clear about this. Sorcery and what we might title magic are real things. This is a belief that's not, some old ancient biblical thing. Certainly, rabbinic writings from, 500, 600, 700, 1,000 years later believe the same thing, that this stuff works. The Bible forbids this kind of activity, not because it is false, and not because it's not efficacious. It's forbidden because it works, right? It is a viable alternative to seeking God, right? If you want to know something and God is not communicating with you, you can do this. Or if you want to know something and you just don't want to bother God right now, you can go find out other ways, right? If this stuff didn't work, it wouldn't be much of a threat. The Bible wouldn't keep going on about how we stopped doing it. It works. The problem is, the reason it's forbidden, the problem is going around God, right? It's usurping divine authority, right? By another means. Now, back to our story. As predicted by Samuel, the Philistines win the day against Saul. Jonathan and Saul's other sons all die in battle, and Saul himself is severely wounded. Remember back in the book of Judges how Abimelech didn't want to be killed by a woman. Same way Saul doesn't want to be killed by the uncircumcised Philistines. But whereas Abimelech's attendant kills him as requested, Saul's refuses. Something ironic about it, it's his arms bearer here, who's supposed to, like in part of the story, that was David once. Saul's arms bearer refuses to kill him, so Saul gets the equally ignominious death of suicide. And the Philistines, despite Saul's attempts to avoid it, do have sport with his body, and they cut off his head and strip his armor and impale his body. And thus ends Saul, and so begins David's serious rise to power over all Israel. Now, I'm going to back up, having raced through that part of it. I'm going to back up now to the story of Nabal, it's so hard in the ear. Nabal and Abigail, who obviously should really be Abigail, but that's too much even for me. Nabal and Abigail, because this story is going to serve as an example for the discussion that is going to follow. What is the story of Nabal and Abigail and David? The story is there's a rich guy named Nabal, very wealthy, 3,000 sheep and 1,000 goats. That's a lot. And David, who is currently in his running away phase, David sends messengers to him. And the messengers say, "We have been treating your shepherds very well. So, if you could give us some things, give your servants and your son David whatever you can for us having treated your shepherds so nicely." Nabal responds, "What's a David? Right? Who are you? Why should I give anything to your people? You're no one. Are you like some runaway slave kind of person?" And David says to his men, right, "Gird on your swords." Right? It's on. Meanwhile, Abigail goes and belittles her husband, goes to David and belittles her husband and tells David, "Please don't do anything rash." Right? My husband is an idiot. His name is idiot. Right? That's what Nabal means. We didn't really need someone to explain it to us because it's like a known root, but she explains it to David in case his Hebrew's not so good. Nabal means boor, right? Fool, idiot. And that's what he is. Don't do anything crazy. And she, Abigail, looks at David and is like, you're going to be king of Israel. Like, she knows. And she tells him, and you, she says to David, are fighting the battle of the Lord, and, remarkably, no wrong is ever to be found in you, Abigail tells David, and of course tells us, the reader, also. And David says, "Okay, right? God kept, you and God have kept me from doing anything rash or crazy. I promise you, if you hadn't done this, they would have all died, but I won't. I won't kill Nabal." Fine. About 10 days later, God does it anyway. God strikes Nabal down and he dies. And at the end of the story, David takes Abigail as his wife. His at least second wife, right? We already knew about his previous wife, Saul's daughter, right? So that's the biblical story, which, when you tell it, it might strike you as a little bit odd. What a strange little story this is. So I'm going to try telling it again. There's a rich guy named Nabal, and David sends him a message. My men and I have been very nice. We haven't hurt your shepherds. We could have, but we didn't. We didn't take any of their stuff. How about you pay us for having not killed your shepherds and taken your stuff? Nabal says, "I don't think so. You want me to pay you for not doing something wrong to me?" So David kills him and takes his wife as his own wife. Now, that is obviously not the story the Bible tells, quite. But it might be like the actual story. And I should say, I think we're getting into the part of the Bible, finally, where we might be talking about actual things that actually happened. Though, again, as always, not happened the way the Bible tells it. Even in the biblical story, David is running a classic protection racket here. He says so. "It was all for nothing that I protected that fellow's possessions in the wilderness, and that nothing he owned is missing." Remember, Nabal didn't ask for it. David just protected them from himself, as he says, right? "We didn't hurt you or take anything." Right? And then says, "Pay me for it." That is a protection racket in the most paradigmatic sense. Not just David, but David and his band of disaffected, desperate, debt-ridden refugees. Refugees is wrong. What's a better word for this? Ne'er-do-wells? Yeah, I mean, like, these are people who have had to run away from society because they are desperate and in straits And here they are in the wilderness running a protection racket. So how do we get from the protection racket, not so nice story I told, to the biblical version where David is obviously the hero? The way we get there is a little thing we call spin or propaganda, none of which is a modern phenomenon at all. Right? This is we have lots of examples of this kind of thing from the ancient world too, and you all, I assume at this point, understand how it works. Right? Something real happens in the world, a fact that is unavoidable and that no one can contest as fact, and everybody then tells the story to make it look as good as they can for themselves. Right? You can pick literally any political moment from the last 4 years, 5 years, probably longer. When I started teaching this, there's a million examples from over history, and it shouldn't be hard to understand that, yes, we can all admit that an election happened, right? But depending on whom you read, it happened one way or the other, right? And so there's an underlying fact, and then there's the way you tell the story. So in this case, how are we told? I want to claim that much of the David story, starting here, but here for us, but everywhere, much of the story is the story of a not very nice guy, perhaps even worse than not very nice, but a story that has been overlaid with a veneer of pro-David interpretation and spin and propaganda. And I think I'm going to be able to show you how that works. And I think that if you go back and read with this in mind, you'll see it for yourself too. In this case, in the case of our story here, what are we told first? We are told about Nabal that he's a bad guy, right? Like the narrator told us he's the bad guy in the story, even though, as far as I can tell, he doesn't do anything in the story to justify such a title. And then we get a witness from an actual shepherd, one of Nabal's actual shepherds, who's like, they were super friendly. We weren't harmed. We didn't miss anything. They were like, took care of us, right? And Nabal is like a real bad dude, says the shepherd. That's awfully convenient for the shepherd to reveal, since, of course, the narrator told us none of this in his story about what David was doing in the wilderness. So we have this sort of faux eyewitness, as it were, to come and support the claims. Then we get Abigail belittling her husband, right, and throwing herself at David. When the Lord has prospered my Lord, remember your maid, she says. And then Nabal dies suddenly, like out of nowhere. Right? But clearly it's justifiable, right? God did it. And then David has this speech afterwards. When David heard Nabal was dead, praise be the Lord who championed my cause against the insults of Nabal and held me back from doing any wrong. Right? Professing his lack of involvement. This is, as happens a lot in the David story, the text protesting too much, methinks. It is often said correctly that history is written by the victors, and the story of David, at least this part, much of it I think, has been written by a Davidic, pro-David author. It is all spin. And I'm going to try and show you how far it reaches. And I want you to understand that what I'm going to do here in the brief time we have is dramatically reconfigure the entire history of David here, which is a big deal, because David is not some small character, right? He's the main character, as I said, of the Hebrew Bible. He is the hero of Jewish tradition. He is the ancestor of the Messiah in both Christian and Jewish tradition. He is the paradigm of the great king and the obedient servant. But I think you're going to see how this all works in the text, and how the text is really straining at times to present David in a good light, and I suggest straining against an underlying truth. So let's begin by looking at David and Saul. We've got two stories, as I said, of David explicitly not killing Saul, right? The one with the cloak and the one with the pitcher and the spear. And in each one of those stories, David gives a forceful speech about how he doesn't have even any desire to kill Saul, right? In the case of the cloak, Why would you listen to anyone who says that I'm out to do you harm? Right? I was urged to kill you by my servants, but I showed you pity, right? I would never do such a thing. You are anointed by God. I wouldn't touch you. I wouldn't hurt you. I have no such intentions, says David. Right? May the Lord judge between you and me. May he take vengeance. May the Lord take vengeance upon you for me. But my hand will never touch you. And again, my hand will never touch you. And then again, a couple of chapters later, in the case of the pitcher and the spear, right? I wouldn't raise a hand against the Lord's anointed. I valued your life highly. So we have multiple stories of David swearing up a storm that he would have absolutely nothing to do with the death of Saul. Where was David when Saul died? In the battle against the Philistines, right? David was supposed to be fighting in that very battle, right? He even asks to, right? Why should I not go and fight against the enemies of my lord the king? He says to the Philistine king. The enemies of my lord the king here are Saul. But these Philistine officers have decided that David must not go to battle with them. So despite the fact that David was living among, working for, and fighting for the Philistines at the time of the battle of the Philistines against Saul, the text tells us David was not allowed to go participate in this battle. He was not allowed. So he was, in fact, conveniently absent. Right? He went back to the land of the Philistines while the Philistines marched up to Jezreel, where Saul will die. How does David learn about Saul's death? A man comes from the battlefield, a man who weirdly claims that he actually killed Saul at Saul's own request, which is, of course, a contradiction from what we saw in this story where Saul killed himself. And this man comes and says, Saul begged him to kill him, and here, I have his crown in my hand. Now, according to the story, David stopped being a servant and a warrior for Saul many moons ago, and has been on the run, and has been living with the Philistines for quite some time, and has been fighting for the Philistines quite some time, and does no longer have anything to do with Saul, or really with Israel. And yet, when random, extra number one picks up Saul's crown, where does he bring it? He's like, I know what I'm going to do with this. I'm going to go down to Philistia, and I'm going to hand it over to this dude who's been like a persona non grata in Israel for years at this point. Probably he should have it, is what the story suggests. He just happened to bring it to David, such that David, working for the Philistines, upon Saul's death, suddenly finds himself in possession of Saul's crown. What does David do? David kills the man for having killed Saul. Your own mouth testified against you when you said, I put the Lord's anointed to death. And he has him killed. This, we will see, is David's standard procedure. Right? This is how David demonstrates fidelity to his word that he would never hurt Saul. Right? The text tells us, not only would he not hurt him, the person who did hurt Saul, David killed instantly for having done such a terrible thing. And David recites a poem lamenting the deaths of Saul and Jonathan, publicly and textually, emotionally grieving over the death of his nemesis, Saul, who's been trying to kill him forever, and over the death of his friend, who happened to be Saul and Jonathan, the two people standing in the direct way of David becoming king. So what am I suggesting here? I'm suggesting that David may have had a hand in the death of Saul. If he did not do it himself, and I think David seems to have been smart enough maybe not to have done it himself, he certainly was involved in it, such that when the Philistines were done with Saul and finished him off, David ended up with the crown That is not a thing that happens by chance. All of these repeated descriptions of how David refused to kill him, swore not to kill him, that we have proof that he didn't kill him, are actually proof, in a counter-reading sort of way, that probably he was a little bit involved. How did David come to have Saul's crown? He didn't take it. It wasn't brought to him as a reward for his assistance. It was brought to him by the person who had actually done the dirty deed of killing Saul. David comes to power and gains the kingship and gains the crown in a coup, which also, of course, explains all the references to Saul's dynasty being stripped away from him. Right? It is true that Saul's dynasty lasted only one generation, but not because Saul didn't sacrifice correctly or didn't proscribe the Amalekites. It lasted one generation because David killed him and took over. And this is justified by the pro-Davidic author in theological terms, because he obviously can't have David just killing the anointed king. So our author tells us that Saul deserved to have it taken away from him for having violated all kinds of covenantal agreements. I'm also going to suggest that David killed or had killed Jonathan for obvious reasons. Jonathan's next in line for the kingship after his father. And Jonathan, you'll notice, dies along with the rest of Saul's sons. So there is no one left in Saul's dynastic line. Now, where did this David guy come from? David was, I would suggest, basically a leader of some bandits in the outskirts of Judah. A sort of band of disaffected fellows. And David and his group, finding themselves not particularly welcome in Israel, shockingly, go over to the Philistines. Right? They essentially go over to the enemy. And they are granted their own city. Right? David says, let me have a place where I can live. And David gives him a town. Achish gives him a town to live in. Right? How does any of this make sense if David is the biblical David who killed Goliath and has been the scourge of the Philistines forever and ever? This is not particularly likely. But if David is, in fact, sort of the leader of a band of raiders, and they're willing to serve the Philistine king and do his bidding, it's considerably more reasonable that the Philistine king should be like, sure, you want to help me? Here. The story tells us that when David was sent to raid Judahite territory, right, Achish would say, where did you raid today? Right? He's like it's like a funny sort of system where the Philistine king is just like got a dude who just raids towns for him and brings back spoils. That's what's happening here. And Achish is like, where'd you raid today? And David says, I was in Judah. I was over there. I went over there. But the story tells us that he didn't actually. Right? He didn't actually do that. He was lying to Achish and was actually raiding some other places. I suspect not. I suspect David was actually raiding Judah, which is what the Philistine king wanted. I think David was a gangster. I think he was a mob leader, like a mafia don. And this story takes the truth that David was raiding Judah and turns it into David's lie to the Philistine king. In other words, you, audience for this text, might have heard that when David was with the Philistines, he was actually raiding Judah. You might have heard that. That was like what everyone was saying. But it's not true, right? He was actually a good guy all along, the text tells us. David, like any good mobster, recognizes you can't be bad and mean always, right? There's always that mafia generosity that accompanies the bad stuff. So David sent presents to the towns of Judah after he defeats the Amalekites. And look what it says. When David reached, this is after the death of Saul, when David reached Ziklag, so he's come home having raided the Amalekites, he sent some of the spoil to the elders of Judah. This is a present for you. He sent the spoil to the elders in the following towns, Bethel, Ramoth Negev, etc., etc. The towns here, the towns there. All the places, the text tells us, and it's almost like a slip of the tongue, all the places where David and his men had roamed. Even though the text just told us that David said, I didn't go there. Now, when David is actually anointed king, It's only in Judah. Right? He's anointed king in Judah alone first, which is to say the very territory that he was terrorizing as a Philistine gangster, and then sent these presents to, which in a sense makes those actions look somewhat premeditated. David essentially sends a message to Judah. I can treat you badly, or I can treat you well. You decide. But it turns out that Saul's army commander, Abner, has with him another son of Saul, Ishbosheth, whom we had not heard about before. And it seems David hadn't heard about before either. But Ishbosheth, the descendant of Saul, becomes king of Israel, that is the northern part, right? Israel as opposed to Judah, right? David is now king of Judah in the south. Ishbosheth becomes king of Israel in the north. And Abner seems to switch sides and support David and actually gets the northern part of Israel, right, Ishbosheth's part, to support David and declare David king, which David, I'm sure, no doubt appreciated. Right? I will deliver my people Israel through my servant David. You've wanted David to be king over you all along, Abner says with no real supporting evidence. Abner comes to David and says, I've done this, right? I've turned the north and they'll belong to you now. And the text is very clear, right? I'll go rally in all Israel, and they'll make a pact, and you can reign over all that your heart desires. And David dismissed Abner, who, we are told very pointedly, went away unharmed. If you go back and read 2 Samuel 3, it says this about 5 times in this chapter. And when he left David, he was unharmed. And the reason it says to tell us that is because later in this chapter, Joab, David's army commander, kills Abner. The story tells us this is explicitly against David's wishes. And we even have a reason given for why Joab did it. Turned out Abner killed Joab's brother. And we get David's reaction. Both I and my kingdom are forever innocent before the Lord of shedding the blood of Abner. May the guilt all fall on Joab's head. May his house never be without someone suffering from a discharge or an eruption. Right? He got really into it, you know what I mean? And David makes an enormous show of mourning for Abner. Rend their clothes, gird sackcloth, make lament. David himself walked behind the bier, and the king wept aloud, and all the troops wept. And he even recites a lament, just as he did for Saul and Jonathan. Right? And he fasts. And his fast has important implications, because that day when David is fasting, all the troops and all Israel knew that it was not by the king's will that Abner, son of Ner, was killed. Again, it's pretty clear that if David didn't kill Abner himself, he certainly ordered Joab to do it. It doesn't hurt that case that nowhere in the text is Joab actually punished for having killed Abner. I think David bought Abner's support, as any mafia don would, but realized perhaps that the commander of Saul's army was, maybe not 100% trustworthy. So he had him killed, but only after he had gained the support of the north that Abner brought to him. Then there's Ishbosheth, the poor remaining son of Saul. He's killed, according to the text, by 2 of his army commanders. His own army commanders kill him. They cut off his head, and they run with it, and they bring it to David. Here, they say to David, is the head of your enemy. You know what David's going to do. Precisely what you expect him to do. In fact, he even makes reference. The man who told me in Ziklag that Saul was dead thought he was bringing good news, but I killed him. Now you guys went and killed a blameless man in bed in his own house? I will certainly rid the earth of you. And of course, has them killed. Dead men tell no tales. And these dead men can't tell anyone that David had bought them and ordered them to kill Ishbosheth. So David has now removed all of Saul's sons, and there's nothing standing in his way. But of course, he didn't do it himself. Remember, he swore to Saul, I will not destroy your descendants or wipe out your name." So David swore to Saul. And sure enough, at this point, what choice do they have left? All of Israel comes to David and anoints him king. But oh man, there's another descendant of Saul out there. It is Jonathan's lame son, Mephibosheth. And David wants to make nice with him. For the sake of Jonathan, you know. Right? Surely there's someone out there from the house of Saul that I can keep faith with. So he brings Mephibosheth to him. But he doesn't kill him. Right? This physically impaired son of Jonathan is not a threat to the kingship. But David doesn't let him go either. He presents him with his ancestral land. "I give everything that belonged to Saul and his entire family to Mephibosheth. But Ziba, Saul's steward, is going to be the one who actually works the land. And Mephibosheth, the actual descendant, the actual member of the house of Saul, David's going to keep right here. He'll always eat at my table. It looks like a reward. It is not. This is you keep your friends close and your enemies closer." I can't go into all the details. There's too many of them. The story of David's rise to power is the story of a mafia don rising to power. He runs protection rackets. He raids Judah's territory to demonstrate his power and then gives them presents to buy their loyalty. He systematically has Saul and Jonathan and Saul's other sons killed. He gets Abner to bring the northern part of Israel into line and then has him killed. He gets Ishbosheth's army commanders to kill him and then has them killed. He takes the one remaining member of Saul's line for himself into his palace for safekeeping, all the while proclaiming over and over and over again in words and deeds his own innocence in any of it. And yet, you'll note, everyone who stands in the way of David's rise to the throne dies, often in very close proximity to David. All of them die, all of them to David's benefit, and not a single one actually David's fault, says the text. I'll shoot out here one more thing that the text says that we can undermine while I'm at it. David didn't kill Goliath. This was actually a guy named Elchanan, as we learn later in the book when we get a list of David's warriors. Elchanan, who's from Bethlehem, like David, killed Goliath, the Gittite, whose spear had a shaft like weaver's bar. This is the exact description of our Goliath. So how come we think David did it, aside from, or how come we have an entire chapter that tells us that David did it in 1 Samuel 17? As long as we're glorifying David in the face of, facts to the contrary, we'll take that accomplishment for him too. Chronicles, by the way, which I like to turn to for the biblical text that tries to figure out what's going on in the contradictory text that precede it, knows both of these stories, knows that David killed Goliath and knows that Elchanan killed Goliath. And here's what Chronicles does with it. You can see it takes the exact line from Samuel. Again, there was fighting with the Philistines. And Elchanan, son of Yair, killed Lachmi, the brother of Goliath, the Gittite, whose spear also had a shaft. Right? So they're like, right, it can't be that one. It must be his brother. Okay. So, fine. More to be said about that, I'm sure. I have been engaging today in some fairly serious counter-textual reading, openly so, right? Is it possible that I'm entirely wrong? Of course it's possible. What I'm trying to do is bring to light what may be a reality hidden under the biblical retelling. I think there is a reality here. I think there was a David. I think there was a Saul. And this is probably the first time in this class that I've been willing to say, I think there really was a. But again, I'm not saying that the biblical text is true. I'm saying that we should be reading the biblical text as a text. It's trying to convince us of something. And in this case, I think it is fairly open in its repetitive sort of stress on various aspects of what it's trying to convince us of. And once we know a text is trying to convince us of something, we can maybe try and see through the spin to get at what the thing is it's trying to spin for us. More next time.